Chapter 14. The Division of Labor and Manufacture. Section 1. The Dual Origin of Manufacture. That form of cooperation, which is based on division of labor, assumes its classical shape in manufacture. As a characteristic form of the capitalist process of production, it prevails throughout the manufacturing period properly so called, which extends, roughly speaking, from the middle of the 16th century to the last third of the 18th century. Manufacture originates in two ways. 1. By the assembling together in one workshop, under the control of a single capitalist, of workers belonging to various independent handicrafts, through whose hands a given article must pass on its way to completion. A carriage, for example, was formerly the product of a great number of independent craftsmen, such as wheelwrights, harness makers, tailors, locksmiths, upholsterers, turners, fringe makers, glaziers, painters, polishers, gilders, etc. In the manufacture of carriages, however, all these different craftsmen are assembled in one building where the unfinished product passes from hand to hand. It is true that a carriage cannot be gilded before it has been made, but if a number of carriages are being made simultaneously, some may be in the hands of the gilders while others are still going through an earlier process. So far, we are still on the footing of simple cooperation, which finds its materials ready to hand in the shape of men and things. But very soon, an important change takes place. The tailor, the locksmith, and the other craftsmen are now exclusively occupied in the making of carriages. They therefore gradually lose the habit, and therefore the ability, of carrying on their old trade in all of its ramifications. But on the other hand, their activity, which is now entirely one-sided, assumes the form most appropriate to its narrowed sphere of effectiveness. At first, the manufacture of carriages appeared as a combination of various independent handicrafts, but it gradually began to signify the splitting up of carriage production into its various detailed operations, and each single operation crystallized into the exclusive function of a particular worker, the manufacture as a whole being performed by these partial workers in conjunction. In the same way, cloth manufacture, as also a whole series of other manufactures, arose from combining together different handicrafts under the command of a single capitalist. 2. Manufacture can also arise in exactly the opposite way. One capitalist simultaneously employs in one workshop a number of craftsmen who all do the same work, or the same kind of work, such as making paper, type, or needles. This is cooperation in its simplest form. Each of these craftsmen, with the help perhaps of one or two apprentices, makes the entire commodity, and he consequently performs in succession all the operations necessary to produce it. He still works in his old handicraft-like way, but very soon external circumstances cause a different use to be made of the concentration of the workers on one spot and the simultaneousness of their work. An increased quantity of the article has perhaps to be delivered within a given time. The work is therefore divided up. Instead of each man being allowed to perform all the various operations in succession, these operations are changed into disconnected, isolated ones, carried on side by side. Each is assigned to a different craftsman, and the whole of them together are performed simultaneously by the cooperators. This accidental division is repeated, develops advantages of its own, and gradually ossifies into a systematic division of labor. The commodity, from being the individual product of an independent craftsman, becomes the social product of a union of craftsmen, each of whom performs one, and only one, of the constituent partial operations. The same operations which, in the case of a paper maker belonging to a guild in Germany, merged into each other as the successive acts of one craftsman, became in Dutch paper manufacture a number of partial operations performed side by numerous workers acting in cooperation. The needlemaker of Nuremberg, organized in his guild, laid the foundation for English needle manufacture. But while in Nuremberg that single craftsman performed a series of perhaps 20 operations one after the other, in England it was not long before there were 20 needlemakers, side by side, each performing only one operation of the 20. Finally, as a result of further experience, each of those 20 operations was again split up, isolated and made entirely independent, so that it became the exclusive function of a separate worker. The mode in which manufacture arises, its growth out of handicrafts, is therefore twofold. On the one hand, it arises from the combination of various independent trades, which lose that independence and become specialized to such an extent that they are reduced to merely supplementary and partial operations in the production of one particular commodity. On the other hand, it arises from the cooperation of craftsmen in one particular handicraft. It splits up that handicraft into its various detailed operations, isolating these operations and developing their mutual independence to the point where each becomes the exclusive function of a particular worker. On the one hand, therefore, manufacture either introduces division of labor into a process of production or further develops that division. On the other hand, it combines together handicrafts that were formerly separate. But whatever may have been its particular starting point, its final form is always the same: a productive mechanism whose organs are human beings. For a proper understanding of the division of labor in manufacture, it is essential to keep the following points firmly in mind. Firstly, the analysis of a process of production into its particular phases here coincides completely with the decomposition of a handicraft into its different partial operations. Whether complex or simple, each operation has to be done by hand, retains the character of a handicraft, and is therefore dependent on the strength, skill, quickness, and sureness with which the individual worker manipulates his tools. Handicraft remains the basis, a technically narrow basis which excludes a really scientific division of the production process into its component parts, since every partial process undergone by the product must be capable of being done by hand and of forming a separate handicraft. It is precisely because the skill of the craftsman thus continues to be the foundation of the production process that every worker becomes exclusively assigned to a partial function, and that his labor power becomes transformed into the lifelong organ of this partial function. Secondly, the division of labor is a particular sort of cooperation, and many of its advantages spring from the nature of cooperation in general, not from this particular form of it. Section 2. The specialized worker and his tools. If we now go into more detail, it is firstly clear that a worker who performs the same simple operations for the whole of his life converts his body into the automatic one-sided implement of that operation. Consequently, he takes less time in doing it than the craftsman who performs a whole series of operations in succession. The collective worker, who constitutes the living mechanism of manufacture, is made up solely of such one-sidedly specialized workers. Hence, in comparison with the independent handicraft, more is produced in less time, or in other words, the productivity of labor is increased. Moreover, once this partial labor is established as the exclusive function of one person, the methods it employs become perfected. The worker's continued repetition of the same narrowly defined act and the concentration of his strength on it teach him by experience how to attain the desired effect with the minimum of exertion. But since there are always several generations of workers living at one time and working together at the manufacture of a given article, the technical skill, the tricks of the trade thus acquired become established and are accumulated and handed down. Manufacture, in fact, produces the skill of the specialized worker by reproducing and systematically driving to an extreme within the workshop the naturally developed differentiation which it found ready to hand in society. On the other hand, the conversion of a partial task into the lifelong destiny of a man corresponds to the tendency shown by earlier societies towards making trades hereditary. The trades either become petrified into castes, or in cases where definite historical conditions produced a variability in the individual which was incompatible with the caste system, they hardened into guilds. Castes and guilds arise from the action of the same natural law that regulates the differentiation of plants and animals into species and varieties, except that, when a certain degree of development has been reached, the heredity of castes and the exclusiveness of guilds are ordained as a law of society. Quote, "The muslins of Dhaka in fineness, the calicos and other piece goods of Coromandel in brilliant and durable colors have never been surpassed. Yet they are produced without capital, machinery, division of labor, or any of those means which give such facilities to the manufacturing interest of Europe. The weaver is merely a detached individual, working a web when ordered of a customer, and with a loom of the rudest construction consisting sometimes of a few branches or bars of wood put roughly together. There is even no expedient for rolling up the warp. The loom must therefore be kept stretched to its full length, and becomes so inconveniently large that it cannot be contained within the hut of the manufacturer, who is therefore compelled to ply his trade in the open air, where it is interrupted by every vicissitude of the weather." End quote from H. Murray and J. Wilson. It is only the special skill, accumulated from generation to generation and transmitted from father to son, that gives to the Hindu, as it gives to the spider, this virtuosity. And yet the work of such a Hindu weaver is very complicated in comparison with that of the majority of workers under the system of manufacture. A craftsman who performs the various partial operations in the production of a finished article, one after the other, must at one time change his place, at another time his tools. The transition from one operation to another interrupts the flow of his labor and creates gaps in his working day, so to speak. These close up when he is tied to the same operation the whole day long. They vanish in the same proportion as the changes in his work diminish. The The resulting increase of productivity is due either to an increased expenditure of labor power in a given time, i.e. increased intensity of labor, or to a decrease in the amount of labor power unproductively consumed. The extra expenditure of power required by every transition from rest to motion is compensated for by prolonging the duration of the normal speed of work when once acquired. As against this, however, constant labor of one uniform kind disturbs the intensity and flow of a man's vital forces, which find recreation and delight in the change of activity itself. The productivity of labor depends not only on the proficiency of the worker, but also on the quality of his tools. Tools of the same kind, such as knives, drills, gimlets, hammers, etc., may be employed in different processes, and the same tool may serve various purposes in a single process. But as soon as the different operations of a labor process are disconnected from each other, and each partial operation acquires in the hands of the worker a suitable form peculiar to it, alterations become necessary in the tools which previously served more than one purpose. The direction taken by this change of form is determined by the peculiar difficulties put in the worker's way by the unchanged form of this tool. Manufacture is characterized by the differentiation of the instruments of labor, a differentiation whereby tools of a given sort acquire fixed shapes, adapted to each particular application, and by the specialization of these instruments which allows full play to each special tool only in the hands of a specific kind of worker. In Birmingham alone, 500 varieties of hammer are produced, and not only is each one adapted to a particular process, but several varieties often serve exclusively for different operations in the same process. The manufacturing period simplifies, improves, and multiplies the implements of labor by adapting them to the exclusive and special functions of each kind of worker. It thus creates at the same time one of the material conditions for the existence of machinery, which consists of a combination of simple instruments. The specialized worker and his instruments are the simplest elements of manufacture. Let us now turn to look at manufacture as a whole. Section 3. The two fundamental forms of manufacture: heterogeneous and organic. Manufacture has two fundamental forms of articulation which, although occasionally intertwined, are essentially different in kind, and moreover play very different roles in the later transformation of manufacture into large-scale industry carried on by machinery. This double character arises from the nature of the articles produced, which either results from the merely mechanical assembling of partial products made independently, or owes its completed shape to a series of connected processes and manipulations. A locomotive, for instance, consists of more than 5,000 independent parts. It cannot, however, serve as an example of the first kind of genuine manufacture, for it is a creation of large-scale industry. But a watch can, and William Petty used it to illustrate the division of labor in manufacture. Formerly the individual creation of a craftsman from Nuremberg, the watch has been transformed into the social product of an immense number of specialized workers, such as mainspring makers, dial makers, spiral spring makers, jeweled hole makers, ruby lever makers, hand makers, case makers, screw makers, and gilders. Then there are numerous subdivisions, such as wheel makers, with a further division between brass and steel, pin makers, movement makers, acheveurs de pignon, who fix the wheels on the axles and polish the facets, pivot makers, and many more. Only a few parts of the watch pass through several hands, and all these membra disjecta come together for the first time in the hand that binds them into one mechanical whole. This external relation between the finished product and its various and diverse elements makes it a matter of chance in this case, as in the case of all similar finished articles, whether the specialized workers are brought together in one workshop or not. The subdivided operations themselves may be carried on like so many independent handicrafts, as they are in the cantons of Vaud and Neuchâtel. While in Geneva there exist large watch factories, i.e. establishments where the specialized workers directly cooperate under the control of a single capitalist. Even in the latter case, the dial, springs, and case are seldom made in the factory itself. To carry on the trade as a manufacture with concentration of workers is profitable only under exceptional conditions, because competition is at its greatest between these workers who desire to work at home, because the splitting up of the work into a number of heterogeneous processes scarcely permits the use of instruments of labor common to all, and because the capitalist, by scattering the work around, saves any outlay on workshops, etc. Nevertheless, the position of this specialized worker, who although he works at home does so for a capitalist, or that is, a manufacturer, is very different from that of an independent craftsman, who works for his own customers. The second kind of manufacture, Its perfected form produces articles that go through connected phases of development, go step by step through a series of processes, like the wire in the manufacture of needles, which passes through the hands of 72, and sometimes even 92, different specialized workers. Insofar as such a manufacture, when first started, combines scattered handicrafts, it lessens the space by which the various phases of production are separated from each other. The time taken in passing from one stage to another is shortened, and so is the labor by means of which these transitions are made. In comparison with the handicraft, productive power is gained, and this gain arises from the general cooperative character of manufacture. On the other hand, division of labor, which is the principle peculiar to manufacture, requires the isolation of the various stages of production and their independence of each other. The establishment and maintenance of a connection between the isolated functions requires that the article be transported incessantly from one hand to another and from one process to another. From the standpoint of large-scale industry, this requirement emerges as a characteristic and costly limitation, and one that is inherent in the principle of manufacture. If we confine our attention to some determinate quantity of raw material, to a heap of rags for instance in paper manufacture or a length of wire in needle manufacture, we perceive that it passes successively through a series of stages in the hands of the various specialized workers until it takes on its final shape. On the other hand, if we look at the workshop as a complete mechanism, we see the raw material in all stages of its production at the same time. The collective worker, formed from the combination of the so many specialized workers, draws the wire with one set of tooled-up hands, straightens the wire with another set, armed with different tools, cuts it with another set, points it with another set, and so on. The different stages of the process, previously successive in time, have become simultaneous and contiguous in space. Hence, a greater quantity of finished commodities is produced within the same period. This simultaneity, it is true, arises from the general cooperative form of the process as a whole, but manufacture not only finds the conditions for cooperation ready to hand, it also, to some extent, creates them by subdividing handicraft labor. On the other hand, it only accomplishes the social organization of the labor process by riveting each worker to a single fraction of the work. Since the product of each specialized worker is, at the same time, only a particular stage in the development of a finished article, which is the same in each case, each worker, or group of workers, prepares the raw material for another worker, or group of workers. The result of the labor of the one is the starting point for the labor of the other. One worker therefore directly sets the other to work. The labor time necessary to attain the desired effect in each partial process is learned by experience, and the mechanism of manufacture taken as a whole is based on the assumption that a given result will be obtained in a given time. It is only on this assumption that the various supplementary labor processes can proceed uninterruptedly and simultaneously, side by side. It is clear that the direct mutual interdependence of the different pieces of the work, and therefore of the workers, compels each of them to spend on his work no more than the necessary time. This creates a continuity, a uniformity, a regularity, an order, and even an intensity of labor quite different from that found in an independent handicraft or even in simple cooperation. The rule that the labor time expended on a commodity should not exceed the amount socially necessary to produce it is one that appears, in the production of commodities in general, to be enforced from outside by the action of competition. To put it superficially, each single producer is obliged to sell his commodity at its market price. In manufacture, on the contrary, the provision of a given quantity of the product in a given period of labor is a technical law of the process of production itself. Different operations, however, require unequal lengths of time, and therefore in equal lengths of time yield unequal quantities of the specialized products. Thus, if the same worker has to perform the same operation day after day, there must be a different number of workers for each operation. For instance, in type manufacture, there are 4 founders and 2 breakers to 1 rubber. The founder casts 2,000 type an hour, the breaker breaks up 4,000, and the rubber polishes 8,000. Here we have again the principle of cooperation in its simplest form, the simultaneous employment of many people doing the same thing. Only now this principle is the expression of an organic relation. The division of labor under the system of manufacture not only simplifies and multiplies the qualitatively different parts of society's collective worker, but also creates a fixed mathematical relation or ratio which regulates the quantitative extent of those parts, i.e. the relative number of workers or the relative size of the group of workers for each special function. Thus, alongside the qualitative articulation, the division of labor develops a quantitative rule and a proportionality for the social labor process. Once the most fitting proportion has been established by experience for the number of specialized workers in the various groups producing on a given scale, that scale can be extended only by employing a multiple of each particular group. Moreover, the same individual can do certain kinds of work just as well on a large as on a small scale. For instance, the labor of superintendents, the transportation of the parts of the product from one stage to the next, etc. The isolation of such functions, their allotment to a particular worker, becomes advantageous only with an increase in the number of workers employed, but this increase must affect every group proportionally. The isolated group of workers to whom any particular specialized function is assigned is made up of homogeneous elements and is one of the constituent organs of the total mechanism. In many manufactures, however, the group itself is an organized body of labor, the total mechanism being a repetition or multiplication of these elementary organisms of production. Let us take, for example, the manufacture of glass bottles. It may be resolved into three essentially different stages. First, the preliminary stage, which consists of preparing the components of the glass, mixing the sand and lime, etc., and melting them into a fluid mass of glass. Various specialized workers are employed in this first stage, as also in the final one of removing the bottle from the drying furnace, sorting and packing them, etc. In the middle, between these two stages, comes the glass melting proper, the manipulation of the fluid mass. At each mouth of the furnace there works a group called the whole, consisting of one bottle maker or finisher, one blower, one gatherer, one putter-up or wetter-off, and one taker-in. These 5 specialized workers are special organs of a single working organism that only acts as a whole, and therefore can only operate by the direct cooperation of all 5. The whole body is paralyzed if only one of its members is missing. But a glass furnace has several openings, in England from 4 to 6, each of which contains an earthenware melting pot full of molten glass and employs a similar 5-man group of workers. The organization of each group is based on the division of labor, but the bond between the different groups is simple cooperation, which, by using in common one of the means of production, namely the furnace, causes it to be consumed more economically. A furnace of this kind, with its 4 to 6 groups, constitutes a glass house, and a glass factory comprises a number of such glass houses, together with the apparatus and the workers required for the preparatory and final phases of production. Finally, just as manufacture arises in part from the combination of various handicrafts, so too it develops into a combination of various manufactures. The larger English glass manufacturers, for instance, make their own earthenware melting pots, because the success or failure of the process depends to a great extent on their quality. The manufacture of one of the means of production is here united with that of the product. On the other hand, the manufacture of the product may be united with other manufacturers, in which the very same product serves in turn as raw material, or with whose products the original product is itself subsequently mixed. Thus we find the manufacture of flint glass combined with glass cutting and brass founding, brass being needed for the metal settings of various articles of glass. The various manufactures which have been combined together in this way form more or less separate departments of a complete manufacture, but they are at the same time independent processes, each with its own division of labor. In spite of the many advantages offered by this combination of manufactures, it never retains a complete technical unity on its own foundation. This unity only arises when it has been transformed into an industry carried on by machinery. Early in the period of manufacture, the principle of lessening the labor time necessary for the production of commodities was consciously formulated and expressed, and the use of machines also appeared sporadically, especially for certain simple primary processes that have to be conducted on a very large scale and with the application of great force. Thus, at an early period in paper manufacture, the tearing up of the rags was done by paper mills, and in metalworks the pounding of the ores was done by stamping mills. The Roman Empire handed down the elementary form of all machinery in the shape of the water wheel. The handicraft period bequeathed to us the great invention of the compass, gunpowder, type printing, and the automatic clock. But on the whole, machinery played that subordinate part, which Adam Smith assigns to it in comparison with division of labor. In the 17th century, the sporadic use of machinery was of the greatest importance, because it supplied the great mathematicians of that time with a practical basis and an incentive towards the creation of modern mechanics. The collective worker, formed out of the combination of a number of individual specialized workers, is the item of machinery specifically characteristic of the manufacturing period. The various operations performed in turn by the producer of a commodity, which coalesce during the labor process, make demands of various kinds upon him. In one operation he must exert more strength, in another more skill, in another more attention, and the same individual does not possess all these qualities in an equal degree. After the various operations have been separated, made independent and isolated, the workers are divided, classified, and grouped according to their predominant qualities. If their natural endowments are the foundation on which the division of labor is built up, manufacture, once introduced, develops in them new powers that are by nature fitted only for limited and special functions. The collective worker now possesses all the qualities necessary for production in an equal degree of excellence, and expends them in the most economical way by exclusively employing all his organs, individualized in particular workers or groups of workers, in performing their special functions. The one-sidedness and even the deficiencies of the specialized individual worker become perfections when he is part of the collective worker. The habit of doing only one thing converts him into an organ which operates with the certainty of a force of nature, while his connection with the whole mechanism compels him to work with the regularity of a machine. Since the various functions performed by the collective worker can be simple or complex, high or low, the individual labor power, his organs, require different degrees of training and must therefore possess very different values. Manufacture, therefore, develops a hierarchy of labor powers, to which there corresponds a scale of wages. The individual workers are appropriated and annexed for life by a limited function, while the various operations of the hierarchy of labor powers are parceled out among the workers according to both their natural and their acquired capacities. Every process of production, however, requires certain simple manipulations, which every man is capable of doing. These actions, too, are now separated from their constant interplay with those aspects of activity which are richer in content and ossified into the exclusive functions of particular individuals. Hence, in every craft it seizes, manufacture creates a class of so-called unskilled laborers, a class strictly excluded by the nature of handicraft industry. If it develops a one-sided speciality to perfection at the expense of the whole of a man's working capacity, it also begins to make a speciality of the absence of all development. Alongside the gradations of the hierarchy, there appears to be the simple separation of the workers into skilled and unskilled. For the latter, the cost of apprenticeship vanishes. For the former, it diminishes compared with that required of the craftsman, owing to the simplification of the functions. In both cases, the value of labor power falls. An exception to this law occurs whenever the decomposition of the labor process gives rise to new and comprehensive functions, which either did not appear at all in handicrafts or not to the same extent. The relative devaluation of labor power, caused by the disappearance or reduction of the expenses of apprenticeship, directly implies a higher degree of valorization of capital, for everything that shortens the necessary labor time required for the reproduction of labor power extends the domain of surplus labor. Section 4. The division of labor in manufacture and the division of labor in society. We first consider the origin of manufacture, then its simple elements, the specialized worker and his tools, and finally the total mechanism. We shall now lightly touch on the relation between the division of labor in manufacture and the social division of labor which forms the foundation of all commodity production. If we keep labor alone in view, we may designate the division of social production into its main genera, such as agriculture, industry, etc., as division of labor in general, and the splitting up of these broad divisions into species and subspecies as division of labor in particular. Finally, we may designate the division of labor within the workshop as division of labor in detail. The division of labor within society develops from one starting point. The corresponding restriction of individuals to particular vocations or callings develops from another starting point, which is diametrically opposed to the first. This second starting point is also that of the division of labor within manufacture. Within a family, and after further development within a tribe, there springs up naturally a division of labor caused by differences of sex and age, and therefore based on a purely physiological foundation. More material for this division of labor is then provided by the expansion of the community, the increase of its population, and, in particular, conflicts between the different tribes and the subjugation of one tribe by another. On the other hand, as I have already remarked, the exchange of products springs up at the points where different families, tribes, or communities come into contact, for at the dawn of civilization it is not private individuals but families, tribes, etc. that meet on an independent footing. Different communities find different means of production and different means of subsistence in their natural environment. Hence, their modes of production and living, as well as their products, are different. It is this spontaneously developed difference which, when different communities come into contact, calls forth the mutual exchange of products and the consequent gradual conversion of those products into commodities. Exchange does not create the differences between spheres of production, but it does bring the different spheres into a relation, thus converting them into more or less interdependent branches of the collective production of a whole society. In this case, the social division of labor arises from the exchange between spheres of production which are originally distinct from and independent of one another. In the other case, where the physiological division of labor is the starting point, the particular organs of a compact whole become separated from each other and break off. This process of disintegration receives its main impetus from the exchange of commodities with foreign communities. Afterwards, these organs attain such a degree of independence that the sole bond still connecting the various kinds of work is the exchange of the products as commodities. In the one case, what was previously independent has been made dependent. In the other case, what was previously dependent has been made independent. The foundation of every division of labor, which has attained a certain degree of development and has been brought about by the exchange of commodities, is the separation of town from country. One might well say that the whole economic history of society is summed up in the movement of this antithesis. However, for the moment, we shall not go into this. Just as a certain number of simultaneously employed workers is the material precondition for the division of labor within manufacture, so the number and density of the population, which here corresponds to the collection of workers together in one workshop, is a precondition for the division of labor within society. Nevertheless, this density is more or less relative. A relatively thinly populated country with well-developed means of communication has a denser population than a more numerously populated country with a badly developed means of communication. In this sense, the northern states of the USA, for instance, are more thickly populated than India. Since the production and the circulation of commodities are the general prerequisites of the capitalist mode of production, division of labor in manufacture requires that a division of labor within society should have already attained a certain degree of development. Inversely, the division of labor in manufacture reacts back upon that in society, developing and multiplying it further. With the differentiation of the instruments of labor, the trades which produce these instruments themselves become more and more differentiated. If the system of manufacture seizes upon a trade which was previously carried on in connection with others, either as a chief or subordinate trade, and by one producer, these trades immediately break their connection and assert their independence of each other. If it seizes upon a particular stage in the production of a commodity, the other stages of its production become converted into as many independent trades. It has already been stated that where the finished article consists merely of a number of parts fitted together, the specialized operations may re-establish themselves as genuine and separate handicrafts. In order to accomplish the division of labor in manufacture more completely, a single branch of production is split up into numerous and to some extent entirely new manufactures, according to the varieties of its raw material or the various forms that the same piece of raw material may assume. Thus, in France alone, in the first half of the 18th century, over 100 different kinds of silk stuffs were woven, and in Avignon, for instance, it was legally required that every apprentice should devote himself to only one sort of fabrication, and should not learn the preparation of several kinds of stuff at once. The territorial division of labor, which confines special branches of production to special districts of a country, acquires fresh stimulus from the system of manufacture, which exploits all natural peculiarities. The colonial system and the extension of the world market, both of which form part of the general conditions for the existence of the manufacturing period, furnish us with rich materials for displaying the division of labor in society. This is not the place, however, for us to show how division of labor seizes upon not only the economic, but every other sphere of society, and everywhere lays the foundation for that specialization, that development in a man of one single faculty at the expense of all others, which already caused Adam Ferguson, the master of Adam Smith, to exclaim, "We make a nation of helots and have no free citizens." But in spite of the numerous analogies and links connecting them, the division of labor in the interior of a society, and that in the interior of a workshop, differ not only in degree but also in kind. The analogy appears most indisputable where there is an invisible bond uniting the various branches of trade. For instance, the cattle breeder produces hides, the tanner makes the hides into leather, and the shoemaker makes the leather into boots. Here, the product of each man is merely a step towards the final form, which is the combined product of their specialized labors. There are, besides, all the various trades which supply the cattle breeder, the tanner, and the shoemaker with their means of production. Now, it is quite possible to imagine, with Adam Smith, that the difference between the above social division of labor and the division in manufacture is merely subjective, exists merely for the observer, who in the case of manufacture can see at a glance all the numerous operations performed on the spot, while in the instance given above, the spreading out of the work over great areas and the great number of people employed in each branch of labor obscure the connection. But what is it that forms the bond between the independent labors of the cattle breeder, the tanner, and the shoemaker? It is the fact that their respective products are commodities. What, on the other hand, characterizes the division of labor in manufacture? The fact that the specialized worker produces no commodities. It is only the common product of all the specialized workers that becomes a commodity. The division of labor within society is mediated through the purchase and sale of the products of different branches of industry, while the connection between the various partial operations in a workshop is mediated through the sale of the labor power of several workers to one capitalist, who applies it as a combined labor power. The division of labor within manufacture presupposes a concentration of the means of production in the hands of one capitalist. The division of labor within society presupposes a dispersal of those means among many independent producers of commodities. While within the workshop, the iron law of proportionality subjects definite numbers of workers to definite functions, in the society outside the workshop, the play of chance and caprice results in the motley pattern of distribution of the producers and their means of production among the various branches of social labor. It is true that the different spheres of production constantly tend towards equilibrium for the following reason. On the one hand, every producer of a commodity is obliged to produce a use value, i.e. he must satisfy a particular social need, though the extent of these needs differs quantitatively, and there exists an inner bond which attaches the different levels of need to a system which has grown up spontaneously. On the other hand, the law of the value of commodities ultimately determines how much of its disposable labor time society can expend on each kind of commodity. But this constant tendency on the part of the various spheres of production towards equilibrium comes into play only as a reaction against the constant upsetting of this equilibrium. The planned and regulated a priori system on which the division of labor is implemented within the workshop becomes, in the division of labor within society, an a posteriori necessity imposed by nature, controlling the unregulated caprice of the producers and perceptible in the fluctuations of the barometer of market prices. Division of labor within the workshop implies the undisputed authority of the capitalist over men, who are merely the members of a total mechanism which belongs to him. The division of labor within society brings into contact independent producers of commodities who acknowledge no authority other than that of competition, of the coercion exerted by the pressure of their reciprocal interests, just as in the animal kingdom the war of all against all more or less preserves the conditions of existence of every species. The same bourgeois consciousness which celebrates the division of labor in the workshop, the lifelong annexation of the worker to a partial operation and his complete subjection to capital, as an organization of labor that increases its productive power, denounces with equal vigor every conscious attempt to control and regulate the process of production socially, as an inroad upon such sacred things as the rights of property, freedom, and the self-determining genius of the individual capitalist. It is very characteristic that the enthusiastic apologists of the factory system have nothing more damning to urge against a general organization of labor in society than that it would turn the whole of society into a factory. If in the society where the capitalist mode of production prevails, anarchy in the social division of labor and despotism in the manufacturing division of labor mutually condition each other, we find, on the contrary, in those earlier forms of society in which the separation of trades has been spontaneously developed, then crystallized and finally made permanent by law, on the one hand, a specimen of the organization of labor of society in accordance with an approved and authoritative plan, and on the other, the entire exclusion of division of labor in the workshop, or at least its development on a minute scale, sporadically and accidentally. Those small and extremely ancient Indian communities, for example, some of which continue to exist to this day, are based on the possession of the land in common, on the blending of agriculture and handicrafts, and on an unalterable division of labor, which serves as a fixed plan and basis for action whenever a new community is started. The communities occupy areas of from 100 up to several thousand acres, and each forms a compact whole producing all it requires. Most of the products are destined for direct use by the community itself, and are not commodities. Hence, production here is independent of that division of labor brought about in Indian society as a whole by the exchange of commodities. It is the surplus labor alone that becomes a commodity, and a part of that surplus cannot become a commodity until it has reached the hands of the state, because from time immemorial a certain quantity of the community's production has found its way to the state as rent in kind. The form of the community varies in different parts of India. In the simplest communities, the land is tilled in common, and the produce is divided among the members. At the same time, spinning and weaving are carried on in each family as subsidiary industries. Alongside the mass of people thus occupied in the same way, we find the chief inhabitant, who is a judge, police authority, and tax gatherer in one, The bookkeeper, who keeps account of the tillage and registers everything relating to this, another official who prosecutes criminals, protects strangers traveling through and escorts them to the next village, the boundary man who guards the boundaries against neighboring communities, the water overseer who distributes the water from the common tanks for irrigation, the Brahmin who conducts the religious services, the schoolmaster who on the sand teaches the children reading and writing, the calendar Brahmin or astrologer who makes known the lucky or unlucky days for seed time and harvest, and for every other kind of agricultural work, a smith and a carpenter who make and repair all the agricultural implements, the potter who makes all the pottery of the village, the barber, the washerman who washes clothes, the silversmith, here and there the poet, who in some communities replaces the silversmith, in others the schoolmaster. This dozen or so of individuals is maintained at the expense of the whole community. If the population increases, a new community is founded on the pattern of the old one, on unoccupied land. The whole mechanism reveals a systematic division of labor, but a division like that in manufacture is impossible, since the smith, the carpenter, etc. find themselves faced with an unchanging market, and at the most there occur, according to the sizes of the villages, 2 or 3 smiths or carpenters instead of 1. The law that regulates the division of labor in the community acts with the irresistible authority of a law of nature, while each individual craftsman, the smith, the carpenter, and so on, conducts in his workshop all the operations of his handicraft in the traditional way, but independently and without recognizing any authority. The simplicity of the productive organism in these self-sufficing communities which constantly reproduce themselves in the same form and, when accidentally destroyed, spring up again on the same spot and with the same name, this simplicity supplies the key to the riddle of the unchangeability of Asiatic societies, which is in such striking contrast with the constant dissolution and refounding of Asiatic states and their never-ceasing changes of dynasty. The structure of the fundamental economic elements of society remains untouched by the storms which blow up in the cloudy regions of politics. The rules of the guilds, as I have said before, deliberately hindered the transformation of the single master into a capitalist by placing very strict limits on the number of apprentices and journeymen he could employ. Moreover, he can employ his journeymen only in the handicraft in which he was himself a master. The guild zealously repelled every encroachment by merchants' capital, the only free form of capital which confronted them. A merchant could buy every kind of commodity, but he could not buy labor as a commodity. He existed only on sufferance, as a dealer in the products of the handicrafts. If circumstances called for a further division of labor, the existing guilds split themselves up into subordinate sections, or founded new guilds by the side of the old ones. But they did this without concentrating different handicrafts in one workshop. Hence the guild organization, however much it may have contributed to creating the material conditions for the existence of manufacture by separating, isolating, and perfecting the handicrafts, excluded the kind of division of labor characteristic of manufacture. On the whole, the worker and his means of production remained closely united, like the snail with its shell, and therefore the principal basis of manufacture was absent, namely the autonomy of the means of production as capital vis-à-vis the worker. While the division of labor in society at large, whether mediated through the exchange of commodities or not, can exist in the most diverse economic formations of society, the division of labor in the workshop, as practiced by manufacture, is an entirely specific creation of the capitalist mode of production. Section 5. The capitalist character of manufacture. An increased number of workers under the control of one capitalist is the natural starting point both of cooperation in general and of manufacture in particular. But the division of labor in manufacture makes this increase in the number of workers a technical necessity. The minimum number that any given capitalist is bound to employ is here prescribed by the previously established division of labor. On the other hand, the advantage of further division can be obtained only by adding to the number of workers, and this means adding not single individuals but multiples. However, an increase in the variable component of the capital employed necessitates an increase in its constant component too, i.e. both in the available extent of the conditions of production such as workshops, implements, etc., and in particular in raw material, the demand for which grows much more quickly than the number of workers. The quantity of it consumed in a given time by a given amount of labor increases in the same ratio as does the productive power of that labor through its division. Hence, it is a law, springing from the technical character of manufacture, that the minimum amount of capital which the capitalist must possess has to go on increasing. In other words, the transformation of these social means of production and subsistence into capital must keep extending. In manufacture, as well as in simple cooperation, the collective working organism is a form of existence of capital. The social mechanism of production, which is made up of numerous individual specialized workers, belongs to the capitalist. Hence, the productive power which results from the combination of various kinds of labor appears as the productive power of capital. Manufacture proper not only subjects the previously independent worker to the discipline and command of capital, but creates in addition a hierarchical structure amongst the workers themselves. While simple cooperation leaves the mode of the individual's labor for the most part unchanged, manufacture thoroughly revolutionizes it and seizes labor power by its roots. It converts the worker into a crippled monstrosity by furthering his particular skill as in a forcing house through the suppression of a whole world of productive drives and inclinations, just as in the states of La Plata, they butcher a whole beast for the sake of his hide or his tallow. Not only is the specialized work distributed among the different individuals, but the individual himself is divided up and transformed into the automatic motor of a detail operation, thus realizing the absurd fable of Menenius Agrippa, which presents man as a mere fragment of his own body. If, in the first place, the worker sold his labor power to capital because he lacked the material means of producing a commodity, now his own individual labor power withholds its services unless it has been sold to capital. It will continue to function only in an environment which first comes into existence after its sale, namely the capitalist workshop. Unfitted by nature to make anything independently, the manufacturing worker develops his productive activity only as an appendage of that workshop. As the chosen people bore in their features the sign that they were the property of Jehovah, so the division of labor brands the manufacturing worker as the property of capital. The knowledge, judgment, and will, which, even though to a small extent are exercised by the independent peasant or handicraftsman, in the same way as the savage makes the whole art of war consist in the exercise of his personal cunning, are faculties now required only for the workshop as a whole. The possibility of an intelligent direction of production expands in one direction because it vanishes in many others. What is lost by these specialized workers is concentrated in the capital which confronts them. It is a result of the division of labor and manufacture that the worker is brought face to face with the intellectual potentialities of the material process of production as the property of another and as a power which rules over him. This process of separation starts in simple cooperation, where the capitalist represents to the individual workers the unity and the will of the whole body of social labor. It is developed in manufacture, which mutilates the worker, turning him into a fragment of himself. It is completed in large-scale industry, which makes science a potentiality for production, which is distinct from labor and presses it into the service of capital. In manufacture, the social productive power of the collective worker, hence of capital, is enriched through the impoverishment of the workers in individual productive power. Quote, "Ignorance is the mother of industry as well as of superstition. Reflection and fancy are subject to error, but a habit of moving the hand or the foot is independent of either. Manufactures, accordingly, prosper most where the mind is least consulted, and where the workshop may be considered as an engine, the parts of which are men." End quote from A. Ferguson. As a matter of fact, in the middle of the 18th century, some manufacturers preferred to employ semi-idiots for certain operations which, though simple, were trade secrets. "The understandings of the greater part of men," says Adam Smith, "are necessarily formed by their ordinary employments. The man whose whole life is spent in performing a few simple operations has no occasion to exert his understanding. He generally becomes as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become." After describing the stupidity of the specialized worker, he goes on, "The uniformity of his stationary life naturally corrupts the courage of his mind. It corrupts even the activity of his body, and renders him incapable of exerting his strength with vigor and perseverance in any other employments than that to which he has been bred. His dexterity, at his own particular trade, seems in this manner to be acquired at the expense of his intellectual, social, and martial virtues. But in every improved and civilized society, this is the state into which the laboring poor, that is, the great body of the people, must necessarily fall." For preventing the complete deterioration of the great mass of the people which arises from the division of labor, Adam Smith recommends education of the people by the state, but in prudently homeopathic doses. Garnier, his French translator and commentator, who quite naturally developed into a senator under the First French Empire, is entirely consistent in opposing Smith on this point. Education of the people, he urges, violates the first law of the division of labor, and with it, quote, "our whole social system would be proscribed. Like all other divisions of labor," he says, "that between hand labor and head labor is more pronounced and decided in proportion as society," he rightly uses this word to describe capital, landed property, and the state that belongs to them, "becomes richer. The division of labor, like every other, is an effect of the past, and a cause of future progress. Ought the government then to work in opposition to this division of labor and to hinder its natural course? Ought it to expend a part of the public money in the attempt to confound and blend together two classes of labor which are striving after division and separation? Some crippling of body and mind is inseparable even from the division of labor in society as a whole. However, since manufacture carries this social separation of branches of labor much further, and also by its peculiar division attacks the individual at the very roots of his life, it is the first system to provide the material and the impetus for industrial pathology. Quote, "To subdivide a man is to execute him if he deserves the sentence, to assassinate him if he does not. The subdivision of labor is the assassination of a people." End quote from D. Urquhart. Cooperation based on the division of labor, in other words manufacture, begins as a spontaneous formation. As soon as it attains a degree of consistency and extension, it becomes the conscious, methodical, and systematic form of capitalist production. The history of manufacture proper shows how the division of labor which is peculiar to it acquires the most appropriate form at first by experience, as it were behind the backs of the actors, and then, like the guild handicrafts, strives to hold fast to that form when once it has been found, and here and there succeeds in keeping it for centuries. Any alteration in this form, except in trivial matters, never results from anything but a revolution in the instruments of labor. Modern manufacture, I'm not referring here to large-scale industry, which is based on machinery, either finds the disjecta membra ready to hand, and only waiting to be collected together, as is the case in the manufacture of clothes in large towns, or it can easily apply the principles of division simply by exclusively assigning the various operations of a handicraft, such as bookbinding, to particular men. In such cases, a week's experience is enough to determine the proportion between the numbers of the hands necessary for the various functions. By dissection of handicraft activity into its separate components, by specialization of the instruments of labor, by the formation of specialized workers, and by grouping and combining the latter into a single mechanism, the division of labor in manufacture provides the social process of production with a qualitative articulation and a quantitative proportionality. It thereby creates a definite organization of social labor and at the same time develops new and social productive powers of labor. As a specifically capitalist form of the process of social production, and on the foundation available to it could not develop in any other form than a capitalist one, the division of labor in manufacture is merely a particular method of creating relative surplus value, or of augmenting the self-valorization of capital, usually described as social wealth, wealth of nations, etc., at the expense of the worker. Not only does it increase the socially productive power of labor for the benefit of the capitalist instead of the worker, it also does this by crippling the individual worker. It produces new conditions for the domination of capital over labor. If therefore on the one hand it appears historically as an advance and a necessary aspect of the economic process of the formation of society, on the other hand it appears as a more refined and civilized means of exploitation. Political economy, which first emerged as an independent science during the period of manufacture, is only able to view the social division of labor in terms of the division found in manufacture, i.e. as a means of producing more commodities with a given quantity of labor, and consequently of cheapening commodities and accelerating the accumulation of capital. In most striking contrast with this accentuation of quantity and exchange value is the attitude of the writers of classical antiquity, who were exclusively concerned with quality and use value. As a result of the separation of the social branches of production, commodities are better made, men's various inclinations and talents select suitable fields of action, and without some restriction, no important results can be obtained anywhere. Hence, both product and producer are improved by the division of labor. If the growth of the quantity produced is occasionally mentioned, this is only done with a word alluding to exchange value, or to the cheapening of commodities. This standpoint, the standpoint of use value, is adopted by Plato, who treats the division of labor as the foundation on which the division of society into estates is based, and also by Xenophon, who with his characteristic bourgeois instinct already comes closer to the division of labor within the workshop. Plato's Republic, insofar as the division of labor is treated in it as the formative principle of the state, is merely an Athenian idealization of the Egyptian caste system, Egypt having served as the model of an industrial country to others of his contemporaries, for example Isocrates. It retained this importance for the Greeks, even at the time of the Roman Empire. During the manufacturing period proper, i.e. the period in which manufacture is the predominant form taken by capitalist production, the full development of its own peculiar tendencies comes up against obstacles from many directions. Although, as we have already seen, manufacture creates a simple division of the workers into skilled and unskilled, at the same time it inserts them into a hierarchical structure. The number of unskilled workers remains very limited, owing to the preponderant influence of the skilled. Although it adapts the particular operations to the various degrees of maturity, strength, and development of the living instruments of labor, and thus tends towards the exploitation of women and children in production, this tendency is largely defeated by the habits and resistance of the male workers. Although the splitting up of handicrafts lowers the cost of forming the worker, and thereby lowers his value, a long period of apprenticeship is still necessary for certain more difficult kinds of work. Moreover, even where it would be superfluous, the workers jealously retain it. In England, for instance, we find the laws of apprenticeship, with their 7 years probation, in full force down to the end of the manufacturing period. They are not entirely thrown aside until the advent of large-scale industry. Since handicraft skill is the foundation of manufacture, and since the mechanism of manufacture as a whole possesses no objective framework which would be independent of the workers themselves, capital is constantly compelled to wrestle with the insubordination of the workers. By the infirmity of human nature, says our friend Urey, it happens that the more skillful the workman, the more self-willed and intractable he is apt to become, and of course the less fit a component of a mechanical system in which he may do great damage to the whole. Hence the complaint that the workers lack discipline runs through the whole of the period of manufacture. Even if we did not have the testimony of contemporary writers on this, we have two simple facts which speak volumes. Firstly, during the period between the 16th century and the epoch of large-scale industry, capital failed in its attempt to seize control of the whole disposable labor time of the manufacturing workers. And secondly, the manufacturers are short-lived, changing their locality from one country to another with the emigration or immigration of the workers. Order must in one way or another be established, exclaims in 1770 the often-cited author of The Essay on Trade and Commerce. Order, echoes Dr. Andrew Urey 66 years later, was lacking in the system of manufacture, based as it was on the scholastic dogma of the division of labor and Arkwright-created order. At the same time, manufacture was unable either to seize upon the production of society to its full extent or to revolutionize that production to its very core. It towered up as an artificial economic construction on the broad foundation of the town handicrafts and the domestic industries of the countryside. At a certain stage of its development, the narrow technical basis on which manufacture rested came into contradictions with the requirements of production which it itself had created. One of its most finished products was the workshop for the production of the instruments of labor themselves, and particularly the complicated pieces of mechanical apparatus already being employed. A machine factory, says Urey, displayed the division of labor in manifold gradations, the file, the drill, the lathe, having each its different workmen in order of skill. This workshop, the product of the division of labor and manufacture, produced in turn machines. It is machines that abolish the role of the handicraftsman as the regulating principle of social production. Thus, on the one hand, the technical reason for the lifelong attachment of the worker to a partial function is swept away. On the other hand, the barriers placed in the way of the domination of capital by this same regulating principle now also fall.